First of all, I want to start off by saying thank you so much to the Celestia team, everyone who organized this amazing event, and the opportunity to be here. We really appreciate that. Good to see some familiar faces. Pleasure as always. Thank you. Oh, lovely. Appreciate that. Today, we wanted to really, first of all, appreciate that we have the opportunity to speak on this event, and we wanted to talk about where we see kind of blockchains going in general in the next few years and where EigenLayer plays a fit. So kind of giving you guys an update on what we're thinking, what we're doing. So we wanted to talk about coordination today, right? We see blockchains as the best mechanisms for digital coordination systems. These, we believe that the rate of innovation of a society directly mirrors people's ability to coordinate with each other. And if we can coordinate more effectively, then the rate of innovation dramatically improves. So just some brief examples, the Roman Empire really dramatically improved the ability for us to coordinate in terms of infrastructure. So we saw rapid improvements in innovation through that dimension. Greek city-states improved civic participation through democracy. Right, so we ended up with far more, involved citizens of society. We saw rapid improvements in art, philosophy, mind share, etc. And eventually, we reached this point where, as we started improving our coordination dimensions, we got to this idea of information coordination, right? The telegraph, radio, TV, film, etc. But we moved to the internet, and the internet brought with it this completely new paradigm in how we communicate with each other. But the problem was we stayed on the old coordination systems of yesteryear while trying to adapt to this new thing over the last, 20 years, which is where you ended up with, a lot of different issues with coordination across information, right? We see misinformation, we see censorship, we see all these dimensions. So let's take a second to talk about those dimensions, right? You've got financial coordination, which is what Ethereum is working on, what most cryptocurrencies themselves are working on. You have physical coordination, which is, hey, how do we look at all these resources that we have as a society and find ways to effectively optimize those, right? Those would be more like DPINs, decentralized physical infrastructure networks. We also have social coordination, which I think a lot of people are very interestingly working on SocialFi, on GameFi, whether it's social consensus, which shows up in a lot of ways that blockchains fork and make decisions, which I'll get into in a bit, as well as identity. Identity is a huge factor because today we really don't know how to discern whether somebody's a bot, somebody's just farming, somebody's an actual benevolent member of the community. There's very hard ways to distinguish between active users in a community. So let's look at where coordination is at today. And I think there's a lot of cool things that the internet brought with it, right? Open source platforms, right? We can all work on some stuff without even having to talk to each other, and open source code can dramatically improve how societies work on projects together, which I think is quite interesting. Kickstarter enabled the ability for any of us to just go in, pop up an idea on Kickstarter, get some funding from the crowd, and kickstart a project. Let's go, right? Let's build some cool stuff. Scientific research networks, but like I said, there's a lot of broken factors to coordination in these centralized systems, right? Rent-seeking behaviors, meaning somebody can come in and say, hey, I don't like the type of project you're deploying on Kickstarter. I don't like this, so I'm going to kick you off, right? I don't like the information that you're spreading on this social platform, so I'm going to kick you off, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is why we're trying to rebuild from the ground up to some extent in terms of what types of coordination that we actually want to work on as a society. And hopefully this is why all of us are working in decentralized infrastructure or decentralized applications, because we believe in some of these dimensions being important. So what is the issue at hand is there's really three types of ways to look at the problems where people come to consensus, right? There's objective faults, meaning I can objectively say that I gave you a math question and you got the question wrong, and so you were objectively incorrect, and that's pretty, verifiable. Everyone can see it. 2 + 2 is not equal to 3. It's equal to 4. We all know that, and so I can say that you're wrong and I can slash you. An example of that would be deploying some code, and the code was supposed to receive some output, but That's not the output we got, right? However, subjective gets way more confusing because subjective questions are like, what's the best restaurant in Brussels, right? Like, we all probably had a completely different experience in terms of what we ate this week. And we all probably have our favorites and our least favorites. And we're never going to be able to come to some conclusion in saying, hey, what was the best one, right? We're all going to have our own opinions. So is it even worth verifying that? No, it's not, because it's inherently unverifiable. But there's this like middle ground called like intersubjective, which is, you know, referential to the eigenintersubjective token, but also like this idea in society where over broad agreement, we come together and we say, hey, here are these subjective things, and we need to make them objective truths, and how do we go about the process of that like middle ground? So let's go into some examples, right? Galileo is a really good example of this because we used to believe that, you know, the sun revolved around the earth, and we were grossly mistaken, but the problem is the church and the Bank of Medici really did not like this idea coming out from the scientific community at the time, and they quite literally slashed him, right? He was thrown in jail, he was killed for his thoughts. And what ended up happening is society realized that, hey, here are these subjective truths, and here's this objective fact, and we need to find a way to like bridge this. And we took a moment to recognize all of these things, and we ended up saying, okay, fine, you know, we need to move to the heliocentric model. The geocentric model is broken. Like, we can observe that these moons exist, everyone can see them, whatever, right? Let's go to something more fun and way more recent. Kendrick versus Drake. If you guys watched the rap beef this year or listen to rap at all, both artists put out a bunch of music against each other, right? You can objectively say that, like, hey, these artists had this amount of streams, you know, these songs had this level of sentiment analysis, and the sentiment of Drake went down, the sentiment of Kendrick went up. Oh, Kendrick only had a #1 hit after dissing Drake. You have all these opinions, but the reality is you can take something that's highly subjective and make it objective by asking the question, who won the beef? And that's a moment of intersubjectivity in society that we're currently dealing with. And we'll see if Drake responds, but as of now, Kendrick's winning. So maybe it becomes objectively true that Kendrick won the beef. But let's zoom back into crypto and ask ourselves, like, where do these things actually matter, right? Why build an intersubjective token? So you have something like the data withholding problem in blockchains where you ask the question, hey, somebody said the data was available, the data wasn't available. This is like kind of subjective. How do we deal with this? So we want to tackle this with the intersubjective token. But it gets far more interesting with like oracles or rogue AGI. So let's say somebody provides a wrong answer to an oracle. How do you decide whether that was correct or incorrect? There's a period of intersubjectivity there where like someone else has to come in and the group has to decide on what they believed was the real price input. Or, and this is where we see things moving forward, is with the eventual introduction of AGI into our lives, which I don't think is as far away as we think, how do we identify that somebody introduced a rogue variable and decided to mess with it? And somebody, whether it's, you know, an external party that is detrimental to our society or somebody who was just messing around, regardless, how do we identify and verify that they were not supposed to include this bad data into the training model that eventually affected the AI, right? That itself is something that we need to be able to objectively verify. We need to be able to achieve a social consensus as saying, hey, this was good, this was bad, and we need to slash those people, right? Because it can have really gross repercussions. So as we look at intersubjectivity, it's not necessarily just about who's right, who's wrong, but it's also this effect that society has on each other that we agree upon. So we want to touch on like where applications are at today, because the reality is most users, most of us, we interact with Web 2 applications still. The user experience in Web 3 is kind of broken to some extent. We end up, most of us end up using applications that are not Web 3 applications throughout the course of our life. And the reality is most applications are comprised of multiple different SaaS modules, right? You log in with Google through OAuth. You pay through Stripe. You have some sort of AI model in your backend that helps Spotify come up with its curations and its recommendations. Those are all different SaaS modules that these builders have to subscribe to. And one of the beautiful things that modularity brought to crypto is it reminded us that the service-based architecture in Web 2 has manifested itself in Web3, right? We need these modules, and we need people to build services throughout the ecosystem to provide value. And I think there's something highly beautiful and important about that, because it helps builders go back to this primitive that they're used to, which is, hey, I'm used to plug and play, and I don't have to worry about this like monolithic stack that I'm subscribed to, and I have to only build in this dimension. I can build and just pick and choose what makes sense for me. But while we want builders to experiment, what we saw in the last cycle is there were plenty of dimensions of value escaping the Ethereum ecosystem, right? We had all these projects in order to experiment on one portion of the modular stack needing to do more than just experimentation, right? You needed to not only experiment on the modular stack, but you also had to build your own trust network, bootstrap your token, build your own market cap, and now your security is also primitive to your market cap. And maybe you lose sight of what you wanted to focus on, which is maybe you were just trying to experiment on building the best consensus algorithm possible, but now you got to do all this additional work just to try and experiment on building the best consensus algorithm. And so we wanted to enable Ethereum native development and value distribution, because why is all this value escaping the Ethereum ecosystem by starting their own tokens? Let's bring it back into the ecosystem. Let's let people experiment by borrowing security from Ethereum stakers and restakers. And so this is why we built EigenLayer, right? EigenLayer is ETH staking along with custom staking, and now we're introducing these objective, intersubjective faults to be able to build this shared security system. And with the shared security system, now people can experiment across all these dimensions, whether it's roll-up value-add services or co-processors, where you can now, projects like Cartesi allow you to deploy Linux VM directly on Ethereum. Well, Linux already has a ton of applications. So why would we start over from scratch and say, hey, we need to build everything in this new primitive when we could theoretically just bring people over? That's the goal. But the reality is we have a lot of different cryptography and a lot of different solutions that are very valuable to our community, because we can provide these very different, very unique value propositions. And so rather than all of these being their own blockchains or their own L2s with their own token and their own market cap, where what ends up happening sometimes is when you need security the most is when it will fail you if it's in your own token. Meaning you saw debt spirals in the last few cycles where, okay, let's say a bridge gets hacked, and now there's a complete exploit on the bridge, and now the token security is built entirely around the market cap. Market cap starts going down, token price starts falling, and then what ends up happening? Okay, we don't use the bridge anymore, someone else rebrands it, they redeploy it, whatever, and we end up with this highly fragmented, highly broken ecosystem. So rather than doing that, maybe borrow security from Ethereum and rebuild these primitives on EigenLayer, on Ethereum, and we bring all the value back to the ecosystem. And as I touch on value, the reality is most of the applications today in crypto are DeFi. And DeFi applications naturally have very, very high value per bit, because the value is financial. And we care about our money so much that we want the utmost security when it comes to transactions that involve our money. If money's moving hands, I want it to go through the safest parties. Very natural. The problem with that is we are not thinking about any applications outside of what most of us interact with today, which is, DeFi is made for traders and lenders and, financially driven actions. But social actions don't really care about the security as much. An easy example in gaming might be, let's say, maybe Nick and I are playing a game of chess. Right? And there's a constant state update in terms of the moves I make, the moves Nick makes, and what ends up happening is all of these moves get written to the chain. Cool. Does it matter? I don't know. I don't think most people care about every single state update. But let's say there's a betting market on the result of Nick and I's game. Now people might care about the result and the finality, because the embedded value in each of those state transitions, aka those moves that we made, is not necessarily the embedded value that's in the end result of the match, because there might be a polymarket bet on it, and that's got way more value embedded than the inherent state transitions. So you end up with this like throughput versus security trade-off where you need high throughput for these social actions, but you might need like less throughput but a lot more security for these value-driven actions. And so this is where we see like a lot of difference in how we need to start thinking about consumer versus DeFi-driven use cases, and whether the DeFi users are our consumers that we're aiming for. Those are all open questions that we have still. So we want to deploy the cloud era of crypto, right? How do we bring all these cloud social consumer applications back into our ecosystem and actually make a dent on the number of users that are involved here? Because the reality is we need to start expanding the scope of our ecosystem. And for context, EigenLayer is live now, and we have a bunch of AVSs in our pipeline. We have a bunch of AVSs that are live. Restakers can deploy, operators can validate, and you end up with this like really effective, benevolent ecosystem where a bunch of people are constantly building and are trying to identify like what is the fit for their products in their market, and they're still inside the Ethereum ecosystem, so they're providing value to all the L2s, which I think makes it quite interesting. The other thing, why L2s, is because L2s can do very cool things for actual consumer use cases, right? The sequencer, if it's, and let's not talk about decentralized sequencers right now because that introduces its own latency and its own complexity while it also has its own value props and trade-offs. But the sequencer can give instant confirmation. You can do gasless transactions. You can do no wallet usage. You can do all these cool things. And eventually, maybe we can deploy Unity VM or the Unreal Engine on blockchains, and we can start porting over like actual games to the ecosystem. So you end up with off-chain gameplay with on-chain incentives, because nobody wants an on-chain game. Like, the user experience will be dramatically broken if I have to wait 12 seconds every time I want to make a move on a game. Like, none of us would enjoy that, right? So we need to be able to do that with extremely low latency while also allowing users to have the on-chain incentive mechanisms that like matter. So what are the problems with rollups today? Throughput, cost economics, security, the feature sets, but each of these dimensions are things that we're tackling at Eigen because we have different teams in our ecosystem that are still inside the Ethereum value props that can like come and solve these situations for us. And what we want to do is enable these rollups to be competitive with L1s so that at some point, EigenDA and EigenLayer can help these rollups outrun the L1 ecosystem. Rather than every project launching its own L1 and that liquidity, that composability, that Ethereum ecosystem value props being fragmented, we end up with this like highly benevolent, self-reinforcing ecosystem. And by bringing these new services, I think we can eventually make a dent across the AI coprocessor space, whether it's more cryptographic encryption, can we bring 2FA authentication? One of the most exciting things I see is the EIP for Face ID. And yeah, sure, you can tell me that there's a high false positive rate in the Face ID, which is why WorldCoin has taken the retinal scan approach. But the reality is, like, most of us love using Face ID, and maybe we need to add a crypto economic cost in addition to a cryptographic primitive. So, there's a high cost of penalty to misbehaving even with Face ID. To close out, I think the most important thing we need to start thinking about is how do we make a dent in the overall adoption of Ethereum and the actual number of users in the space and start tackling some of the UX problems. Big shout out to the entire EigenLayer team, Sriram, our founder. And you know what? Thank you so much for your time, guys. Really appreciate being here, and feel free to find me after to catch me for any questions.
Awesome. Thank you. We actually have time.